The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 541 Forgot that he was strong. It took many hours for Marlowe's private jet to near the destination. Once the pilot let them know they were 30 minutes away, Larry, Marlowe, and the few others who were on the plane began to gear up and went over their various plans. For the most part, the only plan was to follow Marlowe's lead. However, the exit strategies were thorough and well planned out. There were 3 exit strategies that had been decided early on, and they would only attempt the subsequent ones if the first one failed. Through one of the guild room's most reliable new shop run by Chin Li and his sister Lily, they had gotten their hands of teleportation talismans. Since Marlowe had an unusual fondness for using talismans, that was exit strategy number 1. If the use of the talismans was successful, they would be teleported to some place random within a 1,000 miles, 1,609 kilometers. There were a number of pickup sites that had been decided and they could make their way to the nearest one afterward. The second strategy involved a number of vehicles that had been secretly planted by Marlowe's men near the prison. If, for any reason, the teleportation talisman failed, they would have to make their way to those vehicles and escape that way. The third strategy, and the one that was most desperate, was to make use of the inn. If, for any reason, strategy 1 and 2 failed, they would enter the Midnight Inn. The inn had a new set of rules regarding teleportation, and if where they teleported from was a region they were not authorized to be in, they would be teleported to the nearest region they were authorized to be. This was slightly unreliable due to the randomness of where they could exit. It was sure to allow them to escape the immediate confines of the prison, but they might end up still close enough to the prison once they came out to be targeted. Wait, why is the pilot exiting the cockpit? Larry suddenly asked as he looked towards the front of the plane. Since there was only one pilot, the plane was left unattended. Instead of answering Larry, the pilot gave a knowing smile and started putting on a parachute. "You ready to make an entrance, kid?" Marlowe asked with a mad grin. "As I recall, I never finished your self-defense classes, right? Let's treat this as a field trip for an advanced class. Keeping with the logic that the best defense is to kill your enemy first, we will now go over the use of various kinds of penetration techniques when facing a well-defended fort." Larry had a strong suspicion about what would follow, and due to his new strength, he wasn't really afraid, but he just sighed and stopped thinking at this point. Thinking would probably hurt him more than help him now. Marlowe opened the emergency exit and jumped out of the plane, followed by the pilot and everyone else. Larry morosely followed. A few moments later, the private jet went through the illusion formation and crashed against whatever was behind it, resulting in a shockwave that was much stronger than a plane crash should have resulted in. A few seconds later, the illusion formation failed and showed Larry the result, allowing him to suddenly reach a conclusion. The plane they had been riding had been lined with explosives. With a sharp, electronic wail, the massive spider Lex was fighting finally crashed and exploded. He had to erect a shield around himself to protect his clothes from the flames. The fight had been fiercer than Lex had expected. Thinking that he was facing a machine and that it would be weak against electrical attacks, Lex had once again relied on using the array he used to summon lightning bolts. Unfortunately, while the spider was indeed a machine, it was not built based on engineering from Earth. It did not run on electricity, and none of its internal components, whatever they were sensitive to an overload of electricity. In fact, the spider had only become more energized after suffering from the attack and started shooting its lasers much faster. Avoiding those had been extremely annoying. The thing was, no matter how fast Lex moved, he could not compete with the speed of a laser. The only thing he could do was use his intuition to move out of the laser's trajectory before it even fired, which was easier said than done. He had only been able to avoid approximately 20% of all lasers, even with the forewarning. The problem was, the spider was actively aiming at him, even if he was moving. Even if he suddenly changed his trajectory, the spiders would continue to aim at him even as he moved along his new path. He had to rely on various shields and defensive techniques to avoid having his clothes damaged. All the while, he had to retain focus on the arrays he was forming and make sure that he didn't ruin them. Imagine being required to code a piece of software in the middle of a war zone, threatened not only by the incoming artillery but also being vulnerable to his computer suddenly blowing up if he so much as used an unnecessary semicolon, let alone writing faulty code. That was literally what Lex's experience was. Fortunately, his newly enhanced multitasking skills ensured that he never lost focus on his arrays. It took a few different tries to take down the spider, though. Lex's usual reliance on elemental damage, such as the use of fire or lightning, seemed not to work. In the end, he actually discovered how to defeat the spider, by accident. He had spent so long knowing that his defense was strong but his actual strength was weak, that he had forgotten that he had recently undergone a huge boost in strength. After the lotus had recently remade his body, his strength had grown so much even the host attire couldn't perfectly help him regulate his strength. On top of that, he had undergone a growth in his realm. Suffice to say, Lex could now pack a punch. It was through sheer coincidence and perfect timing that Lex had to block one of the spider's legs using his arms after the lasers broke through talk to the hand. Instead of being pushed back by the attack, Lex crumpled the spider's leg as if it was paper. It was only afterwards that he recalled that he was actually strong. Defeating the spider suddenly became extremely easy once he changed his tactics, though he was slightly disappointed that his arrays hadn't been as useful. Next time, he told himself as he climbed to the next floor. Chapter 542 named after the Midnight Inn received thousands of new guests every day, at the very least. Although most of them arrived at the inn through the use of golden keys, enough of them came from golden doors that opened randomly for Lex to have realized that the occurrence of those doors was not truly random. Although he had yet to figure out the pattern with which they opened, he could determine that they were more likely to open up in areas where they were likely to be discovered. There was a part of him that suspected there was even more to it than that, as he had seen a few odd patterns in the kinds of guests that arrived through the golden doors. Suffice to say, they were more likely to be interesting or significant characters as compared to those that arrived through the spread of golden keys. Yet, there was still another subset of guests who came through another method, who often tended to be of even more significance than guests who normally came through the golden doors. They were the pro bono guests. The golden doors of the Midnight Inn opened, but instead of opening near the ground, as they usually did, they opened up high in the air. An injured soul bird fell through the door, landing directly on the nearby spaceship. The Midnight Inn's incredible ability to control passive influence from guests and their cultivation kept the temperature from rising around it, though it would not have been enough to leave a single mark on the ship even if it didn't. The door immediately shut right after the bird fell through, preventing whoever was chasing it from following. The bird took one look to see it was no longer being followed, before it collapsed and lost consciousness. Lex was thinking over why his arrays had failed to get a result. It was not that they were weak, but that the enemy was uniquely immune to elemental attacks. He had other forms of attacks available to him that he had planned out, but he was too used to relying on elemental attacks so much so that it didn't occur to him until much later. If there was one thing he was pleased with, though, was the speed at which he formed the arrays. It was finally getting to the point where he could use them quickly enough in battle. While Lex's repertoire of techniques was very limited, his versatility was definitely not low. Not only was he incredibly strong and tough now, his mind worked fast enough to finally turn arrays into an actual viable solution. Still, just because he liked using arrays it didn't mean he should avoid his other abilities. He quickly went over everything he was capable of before he reached the next floor. Although it did not seem like it, Lex had to admit that the difficulty of each floor was growing pretty quickly. Although he was unharmed so far, he suspected it wouldn't stay that way for long. The moment he stepped onto the fourth floor, new information was deposited in his mind. Interestingly enough, it was a new array character. However, this character was slightly unusual. Unlike other characters which brought about a set and specific change in the universe, this character meant its effect would change, depending on who used it, and how. Lex stopped inspecting the new character and turned his attention back to his surroundings. Unlike previous floors, which took the form of a massive hall, this floor took the form of a narrow corridor. If Lex spread his arms out, he would barely be able to touch both the sides of the passage. He smiled because he immediately took in everything this new floor had to offer, and he genuinely did not expect what it had in store. At the end of the corridor he was facing was a swarm of small feline robots rushing towards him. From the sounds he could hear, he could tell that the same robots were rushing at him from the other end of it as well. But he turned to look back anyway. Right behind him stood another man. He was the same height as Lex, and like him had a very lean build. Like himself, he had turned around and was looking at Lex. Unlike Lex, who looked like he was on a casual stroll, he had equipped an exosuit and had 6 swords floating behind his back. "Alexander Morrison," Lex said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I really didn't think I'd run into you here." "Do I know you?" Alexander asked, a hint of wariness in his eyes. While previously he cultivated his spirit and his body, under the guidance of the Empire, he was now cultivating his body, spirit and soul. As someone who had cultivated only 2 paths before, he knew exactly how much of a difference his new cultivation path had made on him and his senses. That was exactly why he trusted his instincts when they told him that the man standing in front of him was extremely dangerous. "Ah, no, we've never met," lied Lex. Well, at least Lex had never met him when he wasn't acting as the Innkeeper. "But who on earth doesn't know you?" "You're from Earth?" Alexander asked, even more surprised. "It's strange, then, that I don't know you." He could tell that Lex was fairly young, and his cultivation level was on par with him. There was no way someone like that should have been below his family's radar. Lex shrugged and said, "A lot has changed since the Midnight End showed up. I wasn't worthy of your notice before. Though, I believe we have shared the same teacher. I was briefly enrolled in one of Marlowe's self-defense classes." Both Alexander and Lex continued to stare at one another, content to ignore the incoming enemies. "My name is Lex, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Lex? Is that short for?" Not really," Lex said with a short laugh. He knew what Alexander was going to ask. People often assume that Lex is short for Alexander, but that's not it. "My older sister named me after her favorite, well, it doesn't matter." By now, the robots were coming dangerously close, but the two still didn't break eye contact. To Alexander, Lex felt a lot more dangerous than the entire horde. Chapter 543: Increasing Difficulty. One of the most frequent questions Lex faced when he was young was what his name meant, or was short for. Depending on his age or mood, Lex would give different answers, ranging from "it meant absolutely nothing," to that it was an acronym for "laudably exquisite Zebek," to the name of a famous hero or villain. Many people often assumed it was short for Alexander, though that was not the case. The truth of the matter was too embarrassing to be spread. When he was born, his parents were having a discussion about what to name him, only to find out that their firstborn, Belle, had somehow managed to fill out the paperwork and had his birth certificate issued with the name Lex. As absurd as it sounded considering Belle's young age at the time, she had been a little different from birth. She could not be compared to others her age. When they asked her why she chose the name Lex, she claimed that he had been named after her favorite wrestling move, the suplex. His parents had found the story endearing. He had found the story mentally scarring. His sister had taken the story as motivation to master the suplex, on him no less. "You know, it occurs to me that we actually have a lot in common," said Lex as he turned around and looked at his side of the corridor. "We're both from Earth. We both had the same teacher. We both have similar sounding names. We both are pretty strong, and we both have weird families." The last part Lex almost whispered. Had it been anyone else, they would not have heard his words against the backdrop of the approaching robots, but Lex had Alexander's undivided attention, so he heard the words. "You know, I saw your fights back during the Midnight Games. You were quite impressive back then," said Lex. "Some say I'm the best on Earth around my age," replied Alexander with a sly grin. Lex almost chuckled at the provoking remark, but he had no time to retort. The feline robots had arrived. They were not too large, more like a slightly larger house cat. But while their size remained inferior to the more aggressive feline species, the robots were far from weak. Their small, agile bodies were perfect for maneuvering in the cramped corridor while at the same time making it hard to hit their bodies. To top it off, their speed was incredible, their fangs and claws were incredibly sharp and, as robots, they had weapons coming out of unexpected places. While Lex may have been acting quite casual in his conversation with Alexander, the truth was that he was immediately put to the limit of his abilities as soon as he was attacked. There were too many attacking, too fiercely, and too fast. As much as Lex wanted to continue the challenge of leaving his clothes untouched, he failed after only a few seconds. While they had not yet penetrated his skin, the robots were definitely strong enough to cut through all of Lex's outdated defensive techniques. He was forced to resort to blocking attacks with his limbs, immediately entering the flow state and making the best of his limited mobility. The difficulty of the pagoda was no joke. He spread his spirit sense along the hall, both to keep an eye on how Alexander was faring and so that he could use it to interfere with any long-range attacks. To his surprise, despite the fact that Alexander lacked his immense physical strength and speed, he was faring much better. Unlike Lex, who was relying on his instincts to defend against the onslaught, Alexander was using his training and prior experiences to deal with the enemies with remarkable efficiency. Although many thought he had lived a pampered life, that was far from the truth. He was too used to facing enemies with much greater numbers and far greater strength than himself. In this situation, where he was practically alone against a seemingly endless number of overpowered enemies, he was not pushed to his limits. If anything, he was right at home. All 6 of the swords were moving in conjunction with his every step, either fending off attacks or cleverly striking at enemies themselves. It was like each sword was controlled by a separate person, meticulously taking advantage of the situation with perfect teamwork and coordination. Considering that Lex had recently unlocked amazingly overpowered multitasking abilities, using multiple weapons in such perfect conjunction should have been what he was pursuing. Instead, he had been forced to rely on his own physique, unable to deliver even half as good a result as his peer, even with greater capabilities. For a moment, Lex was humbled. Although he had grown strong quickly, and it seemed like he had mastered his strength, he was far from achieving the best he could do even in his flow state. But then the moment passed, and Lex was filled with competitive spirit. From flow, he entered the overdrive state as he turned his attention back to the robots on his side. He moved his left arm behind his back as an array began forming around it, while he only used his right arm to attack. Although he had recently had a realization on how he could improve his performance, he had not yet had time to master it, so he went back to his old way of doing things. He relied heavily on his body's endless tolerance for suffering attacks and stopped blocking. He used each opportunity presented to him when an enemy attacked to counterattack, channeling his Herculean strength through his fist. His clothes were torn and his skin covered in white scratches, but in exchange he was smashing robots with every move. As if that was not enough, each robot he punched or kicked would launch into the horde behind it, crashing into its comrades with devastating might. If not for the fact that Lex had resisted the urge to growl and roar, he would have displayed the perfect image of a savage barbarian hunting wild beasts. For a few dozen seconds, it seemed like things were under control. They had reached a climax, but the 2 of them had managed to hold back their respective wave of robots. Now they would silently compete over who defeated their side of the attack first. But despite how simple and easy as the pagoda had seemed at first, it was no mere child's play. Things changed suddenly when the seemingly random actions of each robot suddenly changed into an incredibly coordinated and strategic attack. It seemed as if they were not facing off against multiple, individual robots, but an army of robots, all with a connected mind. It was like they were facing off against a hive mind. Instead of focusing solely on the 2 of them, some of the robots actually circumvented them and appeared behind them. Suddenly, the 2 went from having each other's backs to both being completely surrounded and under attack from every direction. While Lex was largely okay, the number of attacks he began to suffer increased tremendously. While he was still not hurt, the threat that the robots might break skin soon was immense. Alexander too came under great pressure, but not only did he have a vast array of techniques at his disposal, his exosuit was no joke. He seemed to be surviving. Still, it became clear to both of them that they would need to work together if they wanted to survive the entire round. With an unspoken understanding, both of them acted at the same time. Alexander's suit suddenly rippled with a blue light, though more important was the fact that he suddenly became more powerful. The air seemed to ripple around him, before an explosion threw back every robot near him. Lex, on the other hand, did something much simpler. Since he already knew that the robots were immune to elemental attacks, he had used a different one. Inspired by a video of a devastatingly powerful volcanic eruption, the array he used was one of the few he had already planned out before. It was called Shockwave. Simply said, it sent a shockwave in a specific direction. Practically, the shockwave was so strong and abrupt, it could easily kill. Moreover, it was the perfect area of effect attack. The momentarily lull in the robot's attacks caused by Alexander's explosion and Lex's shockwave allowed the two to close the gap between themselves and truly have each other's backs. So Mr. Best at his age, think you can keep up? If you need any help, just let me know, alright. It's not a shame to ask your elder for help. TCH. You need a band-aid for that scratch on your face? Alexander asked, instead of replying. Lex snickered. Indeed, his entire body was scratched up. But not a single attack had managed to pierce his skin so far. Instead of feeling like he was being attacked, it felt more like he was receiving a special massage designed to scratch an itch. The regal embrace, even in its mutated form, was not a joke. Although Alexander seemed to be making fun of the fact that Lex suffered multiple attacks, internally he was flabbergasted at his resilience. He had seen actual armors weaker than Lex's skin. Chapter 544 Shredded. Their coordination is incredible, said Lex, no longer wasting time with jokes. In fact, to speed along the communication process, he was no longer speaking with his voice, but directly transmitting the message through his spirit sense. They had barely a couple of seconds before the robots attacked again, and they needed to get on the same page before then. Lex could probably brute force this floor because of his incredible defense, but if they became overwhelmed, there was a very real chance that Alexander could die. Of course, there was a chance that Alexander had a way to protect himself in such a situation, but the point was that these trials could be lethal if taken lightly. The fact that even Lex felt overwhelmed on just the fourth floor spoke of how difficult it was to overcome it. Although Jotun did not guarantee that this pagoda was exactly the same as the one he visited, he had to overcome 99 trials to reach the top of the pagoda. Their claws and fangs are sharp and are resistant to blunt force damage, but are slightly weaker than sharp or cutting attacks, informed Alexander. Unlike Lex, he had not suffered a single attack yet as his 6 swords cut down any threat. I don't have any weapons, but I am excellent with arrays, volunteered Lex. By sharing something about himself, he hoped that they could form a cohesive strategy. Then you should have no problem surviving while I take care of things, said Alexander, with a smirk. For some unknown reason, he was feeling extremely competitive. No one from his generation on Earth had ever given him any pressure before. The fact that Lex, who shared so much in common with him, was able to threaten him, awoke something in Alexander that had never existed before. For someone who was always serious all the time, a juvenile desire to show Lex up had taken hold of him for the first time. Since Alexander had never felt anything like that before, he didn't know how to navigate it, so he allowed it to take hold. As if to indicate the seriousness of Alexander's claim, a change overcame not only him, but his weapons as well. Lex immediately recognized the phenomenon. Alexander's grandfather, upon becoming enamored by anime, changed some of their spiritual techniques to give birth to visual effects similar to the aura displayed by anime protagonists. But while Lex could identify the anime which inspired Alexander's previous visual changes, this one did not bring any prominent anime to mind. Maybe it wasn't just for show in that case. Like embers flying with the wind, small red grains started leaking out of Alexander's body and weapons. Although the color evoked images of fire, Lex felt no heat. Although, as more and more red flakes began to come out, Lex's intuition gave him a firm warning: in his current state, Alexander absolutely could hurt him. Of course, there was a massive difference between hurt and kill. But even managing to cut Lex's skin deserved recognition. Unfortunately, they had no more time to chat amongst themselves as the robots reached them once again. Four of Alexander's swords revolved around him, cutting anything that tried to attack him from his back or his sides, while he used the other two to coordinate with his attack. Though, despite his eagerness to prove himself, he retained the good sense to not rush into the horde. Lex and Alexander stayed closed. Unlike Alexander, whose lethality had shot through the roof, Lex was pretty much the same. He immediately felt the pressure of the robot's attack, and was left to crush them one by one using brute strength. Yet a part of his focus remained on Alexander. He could not figure out what it was that had empowered him, and if it was an element, it was not one he was familiar with. He had a feeling that instead of artificially trying to look like a protagonist, whatever training the Empire had given him was further pushing him along the lines of actually becoming one. He suddenly had an idea, though that would have to wait till he was done with the pagoda. The robots had started latching onto the walls and ceiling as well, completely threatening to crush the two under their numbers. One of them even fell onto Lex's head and tried to claw at his face, to no real success. Every fiber of Lex's being was equally tough. He had no weak points at all whatsoever. Still, the psychological alarm of something scratching at your eyes was not easy to overcome. Lex was immediately alarmed, and then pissed. Just because he didn't have anime effects didn't mean he could be picked at. Lex immediately entered the overdrive state again, and analyzed the horde. If he assumed they had the same strengths as the spider he faced, neither electricity nor fire or any of the common elements would be able to harm them. Or at least, it would require those elements in with a stronger kick. But the beauty of arrays was, reality was literally in the palm of his hands. He could manipulate the elements as he desired, even into becoming things that didn't naturally exist. Or at least, into things he had only imagined and never seen. With a decision made of what he wanted to do, an array began to form. But since he needed both his hands to fight off the horde, he decided to form the array at his feet. Technically speaking, now that he was in the golden core realm, he could even form arrays away from his body as long as the flow of energy was never interrupted. But considering the current circumstances, it was best that the array be as close as possible to him. The shape arrays took was usually in the form of a circle. The main character or attributes of the array would be in the center most of the array, after which would be surrounded by a circle. Then the many layers and nuances of the array were written around that circle, adding as many circles as was required. The greater the complexity of the array, the greater the number of circles. When he was at the Foundation realm, although the complexity of the arrays he could form was far beyond what normal cultivators at his realm could do, he was ultimately limited by the capacity of his own mind. That was why the array he formed to defeat so many nascent cultivators was so incredible. But now the same array wouldn't cut it. It wasn't because the array or attack was weak, but because it was mismatched against the kinds of opponents he was facing. Conversely, although the array he had in mind was technically as destructive as the former, he had a feeling it would be a lot more effective. The array under his feet quickly expanded from a single circle to 2, then to 3, and then 4. In a few seconds, the entire width of the floor was covered by the array, but unfortunately Lex needed to grow the array further, so it began to crawl up the walls. But even then it kept growing as more and more circles were added, until it eventually started to creep across the ceiling. Alexander, who was busy slaying the robots, suddenly felt something and scanned the area behind him, and was taken aback. When Lex had said he was good at arrays, Alexander did not expect he was able to sustain such a massive array in the middle of combat. Moreover, while usual arrays looked ephemeral, and almost transparent due to the fact that they were made only of spirit energy, Lex's array carried a tinge of silverish gold. A somewhat serious expression dawned Alexander's face. This was an indication of an affinity, and a very strong one at that, if it could color his spirit energy in such an obvious way. Before he could continue to observe, Lex suddenly moved towards him and grabbed his collar. "Hold still for a moment," was all he managed to transmit through his spirit sense before suddenly surrounding the both of them with a protective shield. Then a few more. Then a few more again. The thing about the array Lex just used was, it was an omnidirectional attack. There was no distinction between friend or foe. There was an explosion of white, and the ground beneath them actually trembled. Since the shields Lex had formed were made of inferior spiritual techniques, they could not survive the strength of his own attack. Lex groaned in frustration and suddenly forgot about defending himself and instead covered Alexander with a strengthened version of Talk to the Hand. The barrier came up just in time before Lex's last shield broke. Snowflakes as large as Lex's hand started cutting his body, thoroughly shredding all his clothes. He released another groan as they actually started cutting his skin. Though, of course, the cuts were minuscule, and barely allowed a drop of blood to drip. Lex had used the characters for storm, sharpness, and snowflakes together to create an explosion of ridiculously sharp and extremely cold snowflakes. Not only could they cut through the robots, the moment they lost their integrity and broke, all their coldness would be channeled into whatever was cut. Lex planned on using this to not only damage as many robots as possible, but also freeze any that survived the storm so that they could be picked off easily. The problem was, he forgot to consider that his defensive techniques would fail and his clothes would get shredded. Chapter 545 Deal. The explosion lasted a couple of seconds at most, but its devastation could not be understated. It was not just Lex's clothes that had ceased to exist, but so had the robots closest to the epicenter. Cut and frozen over and over again, the closest of the felines had been reduced to nothing but frozen metallic dust. In fact, even the walls of the corridor seemed to have suffered from the battering, though they were only slightly worn. But while the epicenter was a zone of utter destruction, further down along the hallway Lex could see the diminished effects. The closest layer consisted of metallic dust that the robots had been ground into. A small distance away from it was the largest region, which consisted of robots which had been chopped into the small frozen pieces. But farther along, the pieces got bigger and bigger until whole robots finally started appearing. These were also destroyed, as was evident from how they were lying still, but only a small distance from them were robots that were heavily damaged, but still functional. It was here that the second effect of his attack began to show. Not only were the robots hurt, their internal mechanisms were frozen. Even if they suffered no actual harm, having their components frozen prevented them from moving properly. If there were any unharmed robots left, they were hidden from sight behind the injured one. Speaking of whom, they were still making their way towards Lex and Alexander, slow as they might be. "The number of robots is a little ridiculous, don't you think?" Lex said, completely ignoring his nudity. He could not, in any way, show that he felt embarrassed or it would only get worse. "Each floor of the pagoda is targeting one of our weaknesses. Every time you show some new strength, the pagoda alters something in the next challenge to limit your strength as much as possible." Lex paused and realized that Alexander was right. On the first floor, he was given a seemingly random challenge, but on the second floor, he faced multiple enemies instead of the one who had excellent coordination. The purpose seemed to be to prevent Lex from dismissing a single, unprepared enemy the way he had done on the first floor. After he made use of evisceration to get rid of those enemies, the enemies he faced afterwards all lacked souls. Moreover, although Lex had not tried it, he had a feeling that they would be able to resist the teleportation effect of his golden key if he were to use it. Then, when he used his ridiculous strength to finish off the spider, he faced a seemingly endless horde of smaller enemies. Although his strength was still overwhelming, it wasn't as much of a clear advantage against their endless numbers. If the pagoda kept getting harder in such a targeted fashion, how was anyone supposed to reach up to the top floor? Not only did this information bring a new perspective about how difficult it was to Lex, he also gained a new respect for Jotun. Lex himself had a number of unfair advantages, yet even he was suffering so much trouble. He could only wonder how exactly Jotun overcame the pagoda. Still, it wasn't as if Lex was at the end of his rope. If he insisted on continuing, he bet he could continue to climb a few more floors. The reward he got for clearing each floor was also nice. But he wasn't about to go fight a war naked. "Let's just get this over with," said Lex as he picked up the frozen frame of a broken robot and casually fashioned it into a makeshift undergarment. Alexander nodded and refrained from making a comment. For better or worse, Lex had killed more robots than him and had taken the lead. Such an overwhelming advantage had washed his initial drive away. With the immense momentum of the robots broken, defeating the remainder was only a matter of time. It was more tedious than anything, and by the end of it, Lex was fairly certain that there had been exactly 2,000 of them. While he did not bother counting them himself, his mind was strong enough. The way he did not need to count when he saw a pair of enemies, he did not really need to count for his mind to automatically come up with the appropriate number. This meant that there was 1,000 for each of them. Not bothering to debate against the logic of a lone man fighting 1,000 enemies with the pagoda, Lex grabbed the last robot, but did not destroy it yet. He turned around and began walking towards the other side, where Alexander was killing the remaining robots on his side. "I have a question for you," Lex said as he leaned against the wall near Alexander, not really helping him finish the rest. In fact, the reason he was holding on to one of the robots was so that the current trial wouldn't end until he was done. "If my intuition is correct, and it usually is, you're cultivating all three paths, correct?" Alexander didn't show a reaction, but his guard went back up. Although he and Lex had worked well together, did not mean they were allies. "Perhaps." "Why do you ask?" "Because I am the same, all three paths." "It got me wondering, that red stuff you were using earlier, was that from one of the so-called true path techniques or professions?" "I've never seen anything like it." Alexander narrowed his eyes and looked at Lex, letting his flying blades do the work while he continued the conversation. "I'm not sure if you know this, but it's quite rude to inquire about someone's techniques." "Oh right, sorry," said Lex as he held up his arms, showing he was harmless. "I just thought that, since we're both on a similar path, we could help each other. I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff I know that you haven't been exposed to yet. For example, have you developed your soul sense?" Alexander did not immediately reply, which caused Lex to grin. "Oh right, shouldn't ask about techniques. I was only mentioning because soul sense is hard to come by, but it's a really great tool. Very useful." As if to demonstrate his point, Lex spread his soul sense and covered Alexander for a single moment. The teenager was secretly alarmed when his instincts suddenly warned him that he was surrounded by an unknown force, but fortunately, it disappeared as quickly as it came. Yet the problem wasn't that there was a force that enveloped him, but that he didn't know how to counter it. "I haven't really gotten my hands on any true path techniques or professions yet, but I tend to be exposed to some very unique situations. As a result, I can usually grow in strength very quickly. But as a result, I really end up lacking in more traditional training and experiences." "You want to do an exchange?" Alexander asked, quickly understanding what Lex was getting at. "You do know that even if I want to, I can't share classified techniques." "Yeah, I guessed as much, but that doesn't mean you have nothing to share. Besides, the Midnight Inn's library has an increasing amount of techniques, so I can always find something there. But, your training and insight are things I can't find in a book." Alexander did not immediately reply, as he went over the proposal in his mind. The fact that this Lex had appeared out of nowhere clearly indicated that he had some unusual experiences. Although his moves were very clean and efficient during the fight, they also betrayed his lack of systemic training. For him to be able to grow so strong so quickly, the things he had to offer might really be worth Alexander's time. If he could gain the same boost, he'd be able to exhibit a lot more strength than Lex himself. Not to mention, if Alexander was able to develop a defense as strong as him, even he could not estimate how lethal he would become. "You don't have to answer immediately," said Lex, and he straightened up. "Think about it and get back to me. You can reach me through the inn." Just tell your personal hologram to deliver a message to Lex Williams. Lex crushed the robot in his hand, just as Alexander's sword killed the last of the robots on his side. Two sets of staircases appeared, and Lex began to climb one without wasting any more time. He stopped, however, on the last step before the next floor. Through this step, he could choose to exit the pagoda. If he took another step, however, the next trial would begin. Lex chose to exit the trial without any regret. Even if he didn't get to experience more floors, his sixth sense told him that Alexander was likely to agree to his deal. That was good enough for now anyway. Chapter 546 Join the Discord channel. While Lex was busy with the pagoda, and Larry carried out his revenge on Earth, things were as peaceful as usual at the Midnight Inn. The number of guests at the inn fluctuated considerably depending on the ongoing events, and the inn was going towards somewhat of a lull due to the upcoming fishing event. But even if the number of daily guests fluctuated, a certain number of guests had more or less taken up residence at the inn. Although becoming a permanent resident of the inn escaped the capabilities of many, nothing stopped them from perpetually renting out space at the inn. Amongst the various options was the small village, which consisted not only of various houses, courtyards, and rooms, but a few dedicated facilities as well. With the steep price of 15,000 MP a night, it was only suitable for large groups of people who wished to stay together. Most common amongst these were various sects and organizations. Many of them had discovered the inn through the mysterious golden doors and then had monopolized access to the inn on their respective worlds. As if a higher than usual spirit energy concentration, access to meditation and training rooms, and first-class medical facilities was not enough, the endless number of new minor realm entrances at the inn were enough to entice anyone. Someone might have wondered how so many different groups, originating from such various backgrounds, were able to maintain their behavior in their newfound environment, instead of trying to extend their hands and claim more, as was the nature of many species. Other than the almost perpetual rain of lightning that happened all around the inn that thoroughly intimidated most of the guests who were actually not so strong, the hearth at the entrance of the inn that used the souls of the inn's enemies and fuel was more than enough to set them straight. So then, having become more or less residents of the inn, these guests often ran into each other. If their proclivities tended to lean towards violence or disharmony, they kept to themselves, but many others took the opportunity to foster friendships. One such group, formed from the young members of various different sects, sat together as they watched the fishing event kick off. They didn't much care for fishing, but the environment itself was nice, and it was a great area where they could just hang out. "I'm heading back to my homeworld for a few days," said the first youth. "Lucky you, I'm stuck on pill duty. My teacher accepted a request in the guild room for 100 bottles of chi pills to help chi training cultivators, and all of us now have to help him fulfill it," said a second. "That's nothing. I have to accompany my sect into a minor realm. Don't they know that's dangerous? I've heard people have constantly been getting ambushed by others in the minor realms. Almost no one has formed a long-term base and they maintain nomadic habits." "I really don't want to go," said a third. "It'll be hard to keep in touch after this, with our random schedules," lamented another youth. "Not really. I've created a Discord channel, so just join it. That way, we can catch up on everything as soon as we return to the inn. Everyone can respond whenever they're back. It's better than leaving it up to chance." The youths continued their conversation, completely ignoring what was happening in the competition. It was for that reason they completely missed when the first contestant fished out a spatial ring, and the second fished out a literal treasure chest. The surrounding crowd, however, had paid attention, and slowly interest was beginning to build in the competition. The more valuable the item fished out, the more the crowd became excited. One of the contestants pulled out a cultivation scroll that gave birth to a massive phenomenon as soon as it was pulled out. A vision of an eternal ice age formed above the head of the cultivator, large enough to be visible across the inn. Vera Joel was pacing around her room anxiously. Although they used to have a lot of freedom even as prisoners, since the discovery of the Midnight Inn and its golden keys, they had more or less been kept under strict observation. Even then, it wasn't as if they were being kept in jail cells. But as far as she was concerned, the situation was no better. As an oracle, she could glimpse into the most likely future. But there was a caveat to her seemingly incredible power, one that almost no one knew of. While she could glimpse the most likely future, she was restricted to seeing only her own future. The only possible way she could see the potential futures for other people was if it had a major or significant impact on her own life. The thing about seeing her own future was that while she could take many precautions against upcoming problems, she could not leverage her ability to help or aid others. That meant that no one had any incentive to help her. While that was not necessarily a bad thing, since she ought to be independent, there were times where that would become an issue. If, for example, she needed to use her ability to make an income at the Midnight Inn, she would not be able to charge people to see their future. Once again, that did not really sound like a big deal. But given her current circumstances, it was a massive deal. She needed to get to the Midnight Inn and stay there, but she had almost no money with which to pay. "Calm down, Vera," said Christine, Vera's mother. "Everything will be fine." Similar to Vera, Christine was dressed in a tracksuit and was wearing a backpack stuffed to the brim with valuables. "We'll figure something out. It's not so easy. I can't see my future inside the inn from the outside. We have no way of knowing what will happen. We'll figure something out. For now, get ready. It's almost time." Though Vera was not able to relax, she did finally stop pacing around. She gave her mother a nod, indicating she was ready. Her mother, in turn, took out her phone and sent a message to a seemingly random number. If anyone saw the chat history, they would see that Christine had sent this number various details about their prison as well as their guard formation and protective measures. While the name of the contact had not been saved in her phone, if anyone tried to call, on the other side they would find Marlowe. "It's done." The mother and daughter left the room, guided completely by Vera. Though she lacked the skill to be a spy, she walked through the halls that made up her prison completely undetected. Her timing was completely perfect, and managed to avoid detection not only of the patrolling guards, but of the security teams viewing the various cameras as well. As if they completely owned the place, the two made it to a security office and entered. As it happened, the guards were undergoing a shift change, and so there was almost no one in the office. "Hey, you can't be here," said the only guard in the room aggressively, but the mother-daughter duo paid him no attention. Vera began accessing a computer right there, while the other directly attacked the guards. As it happened, this was the newest guard on duty, and also the weakest. The chances they would encounter him alone were next to nil, but that's exactly what happened, because the pair had been preparing for this day for a long time. "The defensive formation has been deactivated," said Vera, just in time for her mother to incapacitate the guard. Christine sent another message on the chat and they began to move. A few minutes later, a private jet smashed directly into the building. Such a massive and unexpected incident should have caused countless casualties, but an unexpected incident at another section of their prison caused many of the guards to be moved away. It seemed quite coincidental that the area that the unmanned plane crashed into just happened to lack any guards at that moment. The moment Lex chose to exit the pagoda, he received the reward for the 4th floor, which was information on how to more precisely control his strength. It was not earth-shattering information, but once Lex reviewed it, it would no doubt help him tremendously. For the moment, however, Lex found it impossible to focus on the information even with the ability to split his mind. That was because the moment he exited the pagoda, his makeshift undergarment disappeared, leaving him completely naked before a host of Jotun soldiers. Everyone froze as they stared at the man who had just exited, but Lex did not act ashamed at all. With a nod of acknowledgement, he began walking towards the nearest tree as if he was on a casual stroll. The leaves were not suitable for his purpose, so Lex tore the bark off the tree and wrapped it around his waist, not minding the sticky sap. "Do you have a helicopter heading back?" he asked the soldiers, who were still staring at him with dumbfounded expressions. Chapter 547 Reprieve. "A what?" the soldier asked, breaking free from his shock. "Oh, sorry. A slingshot." Do you have any slingshots heading back to the realm entrance? Lex reiterated, recalling the name of the guide he took to the pagoda in the first place. Oh yes, of course. There will be a ride back in about 30 minutes that you can take. Would you like some clothes while you wait? Sure, if you have any to spare, I'll take them. Follow me, I'm sure I can find you something. By the way, there's a voluntary questionnaire for anyone who enters the pagoda. Would you be willing to go through it? Like I said, it's voluntary, so there's no obligation to do so. But we're collecting information to compile a pagoda guidebook. If you go through the questionnaire, you become eligible to receive a free copy of the guide once it's published. That doesn't sound too bad. Sure, I'll take it, said Lex as he followed the soldier. He hadn't ventured too deep into the pagoda anyway, and he did not think his experience was too unique. Of course, that did not mean he would be giving out information about how he overcame each floor. But it wouldn't hurt to answer a few questions. That guide could end up being helpful when he sent his workers to the pagoda. The soldier led Lex to an impromptu barracks they had set up and handed him a fresh pair of military fatigues which, Lex had to admit, were surprisingly comfortable. The questionnaire afterwards was not a piece of paper on a clipboard, but rather involved Lex meeting with a dedicated team who brought him to a different room where they asked him several questions. He was pretty honest in answering the questions, including the fact that he met up with Alexander on one of the floors. Even if he did not answer, he expected that Alexander himself would reveal that they ran into each other. After all, unlike him who was answering voluntarily, he did not expect Alexander would have much leeway, considering he was a part of their army. He finished just in time to catch the slingshot heading back. How's the event going? Lex asked Mary while he waited. He expected that the fishing event would cause things to calm down for a bit, though Lex wasn't complaining. There was no shortage of things for Lex to do, not to mention that he hadn't forgotten he was waiting on a reply from the Henuli. Although he had given a proposal, they had yet to accept. He also had to catch up with Aegis to see what progress he had made into discovering the secrets of the Crystal Realm. In fact, he should start spreading the golden keys around the Crystal Realm and focus on getting the upper echelon to come to the inn. That would be a much easier way to spy on, much easier to establish better relations, and by happenstance learn various secrets about the inn. He also had to get around to confronting his family, which was a tedious chore he did not feel like doing at all. He also had to check up on procuring the shining irisberry for the turtle. Lex could not help but release a sigh. Yeah, a small reprieve at the inn would really be welcome. The event is a huge hit. A number of guests who were participating in the first round fished up some incredible treasures, including one old man who inherited a mind-blowingly amazing cultivation technique that caused an anomaly at the inn. He might not be able to continue in the competition, since he immediately absorbed the technique and began cultivating. I don't think he'll exit in time for the remaining event, but he's already received countless recruitment offers from nearly every organization present at the inn. It's already too late for more people to register for the event, but viewership has gone up to 13 million and rising. Lex's eyes widened in shock as two things suddenly crossed his mind. The first was that the reprieve he was looking for probably wouldn't come. The second was that he couldn't believe he himself never tried the fishing well. If he had known it was that amazing, he would have fished in it every day. While their infiltration had been easier than Larry expected, the anticipated resistance eventually showed up. Other than himself and Marlowe, there were 4 others who had accompanied them, all of them in the Golden Core realm. On Earth, they could have been considered an elite fighting force, yet they were heavily pinned down by the prison guards. In fact, if Marlowe hadn't been attracting most of the attention, they would have likely already been eliminated. Smashing away the last of their attackers, Marlowe looked back at them without concern for whether he was living or dead. Larry, you follow me. The rest will split up and create diversions. We have a 10-minute window where most of the defenses are down. Once the 10 minutes are up, we have to retreat, regardless of whether the mission is complete or not. Everyone nodded, as they all already knew the plan, and began moving out. Larry moved at his fastest speed to keep up with Marlowe, and even then he was being left behind as they navigated the halls of the building they infiltrated. It was eerily empty, which is not what Larry had been expecting, but he wasn't complaining. The less resistance they faced the better. As for how Marlowe knew the route and the destination, Larry didn't ask. They stopped for a brief moment as Marlowe set down a small black pouch on the ground before he kept running. Larry didn't inquire about the pouch, or anything else for that matter. At the moment, his thoughts were completely focused on what was about to happen. He was finally, about to get some answers, as well as his revenge. Chapter 548 Sadist. A few moments after Larry and Marlowe disappeared, Vera and Christine Joel walked out of a perpendicular corridor. Showing no inclination to be sneaky, the mother approached the pouch on the floor and picked it up. Within the pouch were a couple of golden keys, as well as 100 or so small diamonds. It was not enough to allow them to be extremely extravagant, but at least they'd be able to live comfortably at the inn for a few years. "I'm going to miss this place," said Christine fondly. "Well, not me," Dara exclaimed before grabbing a golden key and disappearing. It would not be long before her mother found out why she was so anxious to leave. After all, one of the tenets of prophecy were to reveal only what was absolutely necessary. The more details they revealed, the more bad luck they would accrue, and the law of luck was a tenacious one. A single moment later, Christine disappeared as well. Only a dozen seconds later, Larry and Marlowe reached their intended destination. There was no hesitation as both of them were on a time limit, so Marlowe smashed down the door to the room. Depending on the situation, they would either kill him or kidnap him, with the preference being for kidnapping as both of them wanted to interrogate him. But once they entered the room, they did not find a scared or alarmed man. Instead, they found a mature-looking man seated comfortably on a sofa facing the door. He was wearing a velvet robe and swirled a glass of wine in his hand. His gray hair had been combed neatly yet stylishly, perfectly setting his mature yet handsome face. In his eyes, there was only amusement as he looked at the two, as if he had long been expecting them. But how he looked could not have mattered less to the two. Their movements did not stop as they lunged forward to grab the man, only for their hands to pass through a hologram. "No need to be so alarmed. Did you really think I would sit and patiently wait for you here?" The man completely dismissed Marlowe, not even acknowledging his existence. Instead, his gaze was fixed onto Larry. For a moment, both of them were confused, but recovered quickly. "No matter where you're hiding, I'll find you," Larry swore with gritted teeth. "I'm afraid that will be a little harder than you imagine, old boy. You see, the moment I realized my fun on this planet was coming to a close, I made other arrangements. I'm already off the planet, and going far, far away." "That's impossible. This is a prison specifically meant to keep you on this planet." "Well, yes, it's supposed to be," the man continued, swirling his some more. "But I've always just treated it as more of a retreat. You see, I've been eligible to leave for a long time. It's not like this place was meant to be a permanent prison. I'd just been putting it off until the moment was absolutely right." The man grinned as he watched Larry trying to understand, doing his best to deny reality. He was so close. This was meant to be it. How could this happen? "How's that metal spirit embryo treating you, by the way? To be honest, I never thought you'd actually be able to merge with it. That's not supposed to happen. You completely ruined all its value by doing that." "Huh?" Larry's attention snapped back to the old man, breaking free from his ever-increasing sense of denial. While he did not know what a metal spirit embryo was, based on the context, he quickly realized the old man was talking about the treasure his father had fused into his body. While he was born with a body incapable of cultivating, his family had uncovered an amazing treasure that his father had fused into his body using a ridiculously expensive operation. While the surgery wasn't exactly a secret, the use of the treasure was. "You knew?" Larry couldn't help but mumble. "Well, of course I knew. Why else do you think I had your entire family banished except for you? Someone had to pay for wasting such a valuable treasure." Though, I let you stay, because I wanted to see how you'd react to the embryo in your body. And oh boy, was it worth it. The amount of data I collected studying how you eventually began cultivating. Just that alone was worth being exiled to this pathetic planet. The sadistic old man began laughing, relishing the horrified expression painting Larry's face. Larry, we don't have time, Marlowe interrupted. Whether he's on Earth or not, we have to retreat from here. Oh, before you leave, children, I left a little surprise for you. Larry, what if I told you that your family wasn't all dead? What if I told you I brought your parents and siblings along with me when I left Earth? You're lying. You're just saying that, Larry barely managed to say, his entire body beginning to tremble. Even if they were alive, how was he ever supposed to get to them? Everything, his whole life had been a game to this man. Am I? The man asked as he started roaring in laughter. Will you ever figure out if I'm telling the truth? You'll spend the rest of your life wondering. The man burst into laughter once again, savoring the pain his words were causing. Marlowe kicked the floor and the wall, trying to destroy whatever was causing the projection, but it failed. In the end, he decided to leave despite failing and began dragging Larry away. Oh, before you leave, the hologram yelled out after the two, I left one final present for Earth. Think of it as a farewell gift from me. It's quite easy manipulating you barbarians. Have fun living the rest of your lives as slaves. The man continued to yell, but at Marlowe's speed they were out of earshot in mere moments. Neither of them put much thought into his last words as they escaped. That is, until they reached outside. The light of the sun had been blocked out by a massive spaceship that had suddenly appeared right outside Earth's orbit. The ship arrived too fast, no one had detected its arrival. One moment it was absent, and the next it was there, as if it had teleported there. For once, a sense of dread gripped even Marlowe's heart. Chapter 549 World War. Lex did not immediately attend to the fishing event once he returned to the inn. Regardless of how popular it was, while listing his various tasks, he was reminded of a chore too important to put off until later. He teleported directly to X-142 and entered the Infinity Emporium. Not only had his order of shining irisberry fruits arrived, Powell had even arranged for a tree sapling for the tree that grew the plant. He gave plenty of warnings of how difficult it was to plant it, but Lex was sure the turtle would be able to handle it. That was, until he heard that the tree had to be planted on the surface of a star to grow. That added an element of complication to planting the sapling, but he was sure he'd be able to figure something out with the inn. Then came the issue of payment. Lex once again had to barter some goods he had collected through the inn to receive his order. He was beginning to get annoyed at the system for not allowing him to convert his MP into currency at a more reasonable rate. He returned to the inn and immediately gave the turtle the berries, and informed him of the sapling. The turtle replied that he would look into it once his cultivation was done, and retreated into his shell. While the turtle disappeared, Fenrir had completely recovered from his difficult breakthrough and became unusually attached to Lex. No matter where he went, the wolf pup would follow him and stick to his side, not that it could be blamed. Unlike his workers, who were newborns but had the maturity of adults, the pup was genuinely a newborn. On top of that, the person it was most attached to, Lex, barely spent any time with it, causing it to feel extremely clingy. Lex could only laugh and allow the pup to follow. Considering the fact that Fenrir was able to partially change its size, and was usually more than large enough for Lex to ride, he often forgot that Fenrir was actually still a pup. The two were on their way to the fishing well when Lex received a system notification. He was a little surprised, since he wasn't expecting any notification, but stopped dead in his tracks when he read it. New notification: connected planet Earth is undergoing a world event, World War. All currencies have lost 100% value due to global blackout, and will not be accepted as payment for MP. Only physical assets are eligible for payment. New notification: guests from Earth are eligible for refugee status and will experience a 70% discount on all prices. All refugees from Earth below the age of 15 are eligible for a 99% discount. What the hell? Lex immediately teleported to Velma, who was in the newsroom. What's going on Earth? Have you heard any rumors about any new massive wars? What is the Council of New Order doing? He asked, though despite his inner anxiety, he had to maintain his calm as the Innkeeper. War. No, there's been no rumors of any large-scale wars, nor have the Order been focusing on that. Well, pay attention to this matter. A world war has broken out on Earth. Gather as much information as possible. Without waiting for Velma to answer, the Innkeeper teleported to his office. He sat on his chair to maximize his synchronization with the inn, and began honing in on all new arriving guests. He started picking out the ones coming from Earth, and began eavesdropping on their conversations. He did not know the situation on his planet, and since war had just broken out it was unlikely all the guests were even aware of it yet. Most likely, they would just be suffering from the so-called global blackout. But at least a few should know something, right? Unfortunately, reality was out of line with his expectations. Not only did most people arriving from Earth have an idea of what was going on, they all kept saying similar things. Keywords like aliens, giant spaceship and aerial invaders kept on being repeated. As if their worries were not already enough, many of the guests who arrived from Earth started getting notifications from their personal hologram assistant. The knowledge that they were eligible for a discount was well received, but the fact that their currencies held no worth made almost everyone immediately broke. Panic and chaos started to spread amongst the refugees. Though Lex was extremely troubled by what he was hearing, he did not completely lose his mind. He set a new area where all incoming refugees would teleport to, so that the chaos they would create would not spread to the general public. Moreover, he deployed many guards and workers to calm all incoming people down. Though they felt like the inn was taking advantage of them, there was nothing Lex could do about that. MP was one of the few things about the system that had forever been outside the domain of his authority. Fortunately, the system was able to claim their physical assets as payment even if they didn't bring them. Of course, that did not extend to assets such as buildings or land. Yet things like furniture and used cars, apparently, were fully acceptable. But the logistics and technicalities of how the system accepted payments was the least of what was on Lex's mind. God damn it, he exclaimed, and decided to teleport to Earth. No matter how much he hated his family right now, he could not leave them to fend for themselves. Even as Lex passed a few instructions to Mary and teleported to Earth, he did not stop cursing his family. If those stupid, greedy, fat, annoying, stupid people had not kept secrets from him, he would have never decided to ignore them, and he would not be in this situation. No matter how much he hated his situation with his family, he could not help but give them the benefit of doubt. Moreover, no matter what his parents did, he could not abandon his sisters. Belle would be fine even in war, but his younger two sisters deserved better. Unfortunately, due to the very secrets Lex was cursing his family for keeping, he did not know that his family on Earth were all spirit clones. Not only that, the clones had all vanished from Earth some time ago. Chapter 550. How was he supposed to know? As panicked as Lex was about the situation, he did not lose his senses. He honed in on all the refugees and paid close attention to whatever they had to say. So far, none of them had a clear picture of what was happening. Everyone seemed to be reiterating the same things. They had been hit by a power outage, and though some of them had backup generators, none of their devices seemed to be working. Due to this, there was a complete blockade on communication via any electronic devices. As a result, they did not know the extent of what the situation was. What they did know was that there was a gargantuan vessel, or possibly multiple vessels parked in the sky above the planet. Though the massive vessel itself had not attacked yet, many of them witnessed many distant, smaller vessels approaching the planet. Out of sheer panic they had escaped to the inn, unaware of what else to do. Mary, have the planning division find a spot to build the temporary refugee spot. I won't force them to separate from the rest of the guests, but I think it'll be good if we have a designated spot where refugees can gather amongst themselves. Not wanting to wait much longer, Lex decided to teleport to Earth. Still bereft of any gear fitting his current realm, He decided to stick to the army fatigues given to him by the Empire, for not only were they extremely comfortable, they were easy to move and seemed durable. He was unsure exactly how long it had been since he had last been to Earth, but it had been a long time. Lex appeared in an unfamiliar street, causing him to feel slightly confused before he remembered that he was in London. He looked up and, indeed, saw the massive spaceship hovering above Earth. Upon observing its massive, oval shape blocking out most of the sky, Lex decided to dump all the physics he had learned in high school and college, because there was no way something so massive should have come near a planet without being affected by it, or causing an adverse effect in return. Even the moon caused changes in the tides due to its gravitational pull, so if either the ship was massive enough to block the view, or close enough to cause the same effect, things should not have been so calm. But then again, there was a global electronic blackout and information was scarce, so there was a real possibility that he was just lacking information. Lex shook his head. That didn't matter right now. What mattered was that while the street he was on seemed barren and as if it suffered a storm, and there was not a single person in sight, there were also no invaders in sight either. His senses were sharp enough that if there was fighting even in the distance, he would have picked up on it. Yet while there were sounds of screaming, running, and general panic that Lex could pick up, there was no fighting. Or at least, no fighting that wasn't happening between humans. In the distance, though, he could pick up a seemingly endless stream of ships exiting the ship in the sky and descending towards Earth. Whatever was happening, it hadn't made its way here yet, which was good enough for Lex. He sprinted towards his old home, reaching quickly due to speed. Things were actually progressing pretty smoothly for once. He expected to have to fight through an army of villains who happened to be between him and his family. Thinking about it, that was pretty stupid. Just because he often faced difficult situations didn't mean the universe was specifically targeting him to make his life difficult. The door to the house was locked, but Lex didn't even need to exert himself to break it. Considering the circumstances, he didn't think anyone would mind. "Hey, is anyone home?" he yelled, as he extended his spirit sense out to search the house. Immediately, he noticed a number of unusual details. He did not recognize the furniture, and much of the layout of the house had been changed. There were fewer bedrooms and the rooms had instead been turned into storage rooms. Moreover, he noticed the distinct lack of certain items he knew his sisters would never leave. There were still minor details. The most significant thing he noticed was that the house was only occupied by 2 extremely senior citizens. "Stay back, I have a knife," yelled an old lady from somewhere deeper inside the house. Lex had a daunting realization, though he held out a faint hope still. Calmly, and prepared to hear bad news, Lex walked forward so that he came into view of the old couple. There was an old, feeble-looking man sitting in a wheelchair, while a similarly aged petite lady stood in front of him, holding a kitchen knife in her softly trembling hand. "Don't come any closer, we don't have any money," said the old lady, putting on a brave front. I don't mean any harm. I used to know the people who lived here before, I didn't know they moved out," Lex gently explained. "Is there any chance you know where they might have gone?" It had been a long time since he came to Earth, so it was entirely possible his family moved. In fact, it was highly likely since his entire childhood he lived a nomadic life. Belle had even informed him that she had gotten a new government job, which might have caused them to move. Or maybe his parents came back and decided to go somewhere else on an expedition. Maybe them moving even had something to do with their secret. There was literally no way for him to know. He suddenly felt like an idiot for waiting so long to confront them about that, but in his defense, how was he supposed to know the world would be invaded? That had never happened before. Chapter 551, Do Something. We don't know, the old lady exclaimed, not letting down her guard. Though the house was dark, the old couple had a couple of lit candles placed around the room. The warm, yet flickering light on her increasingly trembling hand really touched Lex's soft spot. He was not exactly a philanthropist, but even he would not ignore such a desperate situation in front of him. He summoned a golden key in front of the couple, and used his spirit sense to grab onto it. Slowly and gently, he moved the key through the air, to the old couple. "Please, I'm just looking for my family. There's a lot of trouble brewing outside, and I want to protect them." Though Lex's tone was gentle, the floating nearing them did not exactly put them at ease. Yet Lex only placed the key on a table near them. "The key is a special treasure. You can use it when you're in trouble, and it'll keep you safe. All you need to do is snap it, and it's easy to snap." The old lady was frightened, not to mention confused, but by now she could definitely see that Lex meant no harm. Still, she did not dare lower the knife. She did, however, tell him a little bit more. "We got this house from an agent. We never met the old owners, nor do we know anything about them." I understand. In that case, my apologies for barging into your home. I broke the lock on your front door, but I'll make it up to you. Just be sure to use the golden key when you're in trouble. The situation is not looking too great." The old lady barely nodded, but did not say anything, and kept her eyes peeled on Lex as he retreated out of her house. Once outside, Lex sighed. This was a conundrum. How was he supposed to find them? If there weren't a blackout, he could just try calling them. But since there wasn't much he could do except search around randomly. He was desperate, but he wasn't stupid. Eventually, he thought of a possible solution. He teleported back to the inn and scanned its premises. Unfortunately, none of the members of the Council of the New Order he recognized were present. "Mary, keep an eye out. As soon as any members of the council appear, call me and let me know." "Sure. By the way, soon after you left, Velma published an emergency newsletter spreading the news about the invasion on Earth. While she has yet to collect a lot of information on it yet, there was a response from some of the other guests to the little she did provide in her newsletter. To be specific, there's a philanthropic couple who wanted to inquire if they could donate to a refugee relief fund, since the inn was taking in refugees. It could help pay for any refugees who cannot pay for themselves." Lex paused his train of thoughts. That wasn't such a bad idea actually. Go ahead and tell them they can. In fact, I'll be the first to make a donation. Lex donated 10 million MP and set up the refugee fund. He also told Mary to inform Velma she could spread the word about the fund, but he did not want people going around soliciting for donations. Although it may sound petty of him to prevent that, he could not help anyone if the image of his inn was hampered by people going around asking for money. If it came to it, he would make more donations, but he could not turn his inn into a place people wanted to avoid due to solicitors. With that done, he decided to go back to Earth. Until some progress was made on finding the council members, he would have to search the area using his spirit sense. As unlikely as it was, maybe he would get lucky. Larry was grimacing as he glared up at the ship. He did not understand what was happening, but he somehow blamed the old man for it. After asking Marlowe, he found out that the old guy's name was Jeffrey. Try as he might, he could not get Jeffrey's last scream out of his mind about all of them ending up as slaves. What he could not understand was how Jeffrey could have managed such a thing. If he had access to such a massive spaceship that could invade Earth whenever he wanted, why did he stay on Earth as a prisoner? It was boggling his mind. Not to mention what he said about Larry's family. Jeffrey was right. No matter what happened, Larry would never stop wondering if he still held his family prisoner. It would haunt him forever. "I have news," said Marlowe, who deactivated one of the talismans he had. Much like when he went to Vegas Minima to fight zombies, he had tiny talismans hidden on his body in the shape of a tattoo. Their uses were extremely diverse, and included a communication talisman. "All electronics are down no matter where I reach out to. The only means to long-distance communication available is through spiritual means. As far as anyone can tell, the countless ships coming down to Earth seem to be heading towards Estonia. As for the reason, well, your guess is as good as mine. In the underground lab where Adrull conducted his secret experiments on AI, the man himself lay prone in a chair. Through means he did not understand, the AI, controlling his cultivation, had taken control of his body. It could not make him perform certain actions, or any actions for that matter. All it could do was prevent him from using his own body. The panic and confusion that had initially gripped him had worn down by now, but there was not much else he could do. His assistants in the lab would ensure he remained fed and kept alive, but without electricity, they were all trapped in the basement in the dark. They would have to wait for the blackout to end before they could figure out a solution to his problem. Something had to change soon, and it did. There was an explosion somewhere above ground, and then the building around them shook. Chapter 552 Mad Marlowe 2. A few hours went by while Lex searched London with his spirit sense. To maximize the possibility of finding his family, he even summoned Fenrir and rode on his back. His goal was not to speed up his search, for he could run fast enough on his own. No, he was hoping Fenrir would pick up a scent close enough to his own to discover his family. As wild as it sounded, this was not a blind hope, as Fenrir had displayed the ability to recognize groups by associating their smells while at the inn. Still, as predicted, his search wrought no results other than to attract unusual looks from people who assumed Fenrir was a strange, hairy horse. What did happen, eventually, was that Mary informed him that a number of council members had appeared at the inn and were having a meeting. Upon hearing the news, Lex sent Fenrir back to the inn. A thought occurred to him. He could easily summon and send Fenrir from the inn to wherever he was because of a prize he used on Fenrir, but if he ever needed to send the rest of his workers out of the inn to a specific world, it would be a real hassle. That, once again, was an issue for later. Lex teleported back to the inn and appeared in his office. Instead of going directly to the councilmen, he decided to spy on their meeting first. While Lex personally didn't know all the councillors or their positions, Velma had provided him with a list of all the information she had on them. The moment he got his hands on the information, he knew his decision to use the newsroom as a means to collect information was paying off. Not only did it have a lot of pertinent data, such as name, designation, political affiliations, and some ongoing partnerships, it had a whole set of information he could not even begin to imagine how she collected. It included things like favorite meal of the day, usual order of wearing socks, favorite color, least favorite smell, and thoughts on male pattern baldness. The list went on, but Lex saw no need to focus on such information. He listened in on the meeting. Someone called Bernard Brown was leading the meeting, and he was one of the senior members of the council, with great political support. Preliminary attempts to contact Fernanda have failed, he said in an extremely grave tone. The issue is, the only means we have to contact her are technological, and there is a global blackout for all electronic devices. We have confirmed this is not the effect of a global EMP, but rather some other phenomenon of which we have no information. I don't care about that, tell me about the damn aliens, a panicked man interrupted. According to Velma's notes, he was from Latvia, a country neighboring Estonia. Politically, he was weak, except his strong connections to the Russian counselor, who happened to be missing from the meeting. Bernard did not let any displeasure show on his face as he transitioned towards the relevant topic. Though perhaps that was only because he looked so disturbed as it was. As I said, all electronics are down, but we've been able to communicate around the globe using various spiritual techniques, with communication talismans being the easiest to use due to their cheap price. According to current reports, all extraterrestrial ships that have come from the mothership have headed towards Estonia, for reasons unknown to us. We have not been able to confirm their motives yet, but we have confirmed that they are non-communicative and likely hostile. We have lost contact with all operatives who have tried to approach any of the landing vessels. Even my dead grandparents can tell that they're hostile. Even the Midnight Inn has declared Earth has entered a world war and labeled us all refugees. The question is, how do we fight them? All our missiles are inoperable. The only defense we have are the pre-existing formations we've set up. While Bernard kept up a calm facade, not everyone was able to contain themselves as well as him. Lex felt slightly sick when Mary told him that he had been earning tons of MP as a lot of people had started bringing in physical assets that they had hidden or hoarded over their lives, and started converting them to MP for fear of further loss of value. Gold bricks, jewels and cars were actually the most common form of asset people were paying with, though of course Lex never received any of them. He only got MP. The number of people who had entire suitcases filled with dollars who were crying and pleading for them to be accepted was actually quite high. We cannot yet determine the lethality of our weapons. Guns still work, mostly, as well as most other mechanical weapons. It would be our best bet if the aliens proved weak to them, for if we have to rely on our spiritual weapons, we will quickly run short on supply. "I have news," yelled another person who ran into the room, having worked up a sweat. Lex recognized this man even without Velma's notes. He was Marlowe's butler. "King Marlowe has sent news. His current location is in India, but he had decided to fly right into the air to intercept one of the ships entering Earth and test out their strength." The news confounded many people, including Lex. But regardless of how insane it was, at least they'd be able to get some information on the strength and capabilities of the aliens. Moreover, His Majesty has declared that the Council should do their best to contact Fernanda, as he has reason to believe the current invaders have been lured here by someone she had captive on the planet. Someone by the name of Jeffrey. Murmurs filled the room as everyone began discussing the news amongst themselves. It was no secret that the Council actually disliked Marlowe and his brutish ways. But the man was a walking nuclear bomb, they had to deal with him. But suddenly, everyone was grateful for his trademark brashness. Who else would be crazy enough to fly towards aliens and fight them in the sky? Chapter 553 A New Gift. The purpose of spying on the meeting was not to gain information on the current situation, although that was definitely helpful in its own way. No, the purpose was to wait for someone who was based out of London. That way he could ask them about Belle. Of course he would not do so using his identity as the Innkeeper, but as Leo. That way he still had a connection to the inn, meaning they were more likely to pay attention to him. If he just showed up as Lex, it was unlikely anyone would give him the time of day, considering they had their plates full. While everyone waited for Marlowe's report on the aliens, the meeting continued. They were mostly discussing defensive measures and troop movements, things that were of little importance to Lex. But there was one discovery that improved the mood. Someone discovered that if they brought their electronics to the inn, they would suddenly start working. The reason this was important was because it meant that the electronics themselves were fine, and that there was simply some kind of interference preventing them from working. All they had to do was figure out what that interference was, and how to get rid of it. While Lex was focused on the meeting, and all things related to Earth, many other things were happening at the same time. Lex of course kept a part of his attention focused on the inn because he did not want to miss any important developments. However, some important events were taking place outside the inn. Adrift looked up in fear at whatever it was standing above him. Countless metal things were looking down at him, and though he could hear no sounds, he could sense that they were communicating, and likely about him. After all, everyone else around him was already dead. The things had no clear archetype, as they all more or less took different shapes. What was common in all of them, however, was that their bodies looked synthetic. Some of them did not have distinguishable arms or legs, and ejected limbs from their unusually shaped torsos as needed. Others had a humanoid form, yet lacked a head. Others still hovered in the air without any visible propulsion mechanism, while the remainder took on the shapes of various animals. Some of them looked like they were made from metal, and adhered to the standard Earthling perception of robots or machines. But there were some that appeared to have their bodies made of something strongly resembling plastic. There was even one that looked like its body was made of normal organic matter, though there was nothing calming about that at all, as it looked like it came out of a horror film. With transparent skin, all of its unusual muscles and sinew were visible. For a time they simply stood around Adrift, looking down on him in silence. He could not even whimper if he wanted to, as he had no control over his body, despite the many fail-safes that had been programmed into his AI. Suddenly, one of the things lifted him up by his foot, dangling him in the air. A wire came out of the creature's limb and forcefully connected itself at the base of his skull, suddenly allowing Adrift to hear a new voice in his head. According to our precursory findings, this planet is not advanced enough to develop a fully sentient AI. Who aided you in its development? Both you and the instigator are equally guilty of AI slavery. We don't know. Adrift had begun to reply normally, as himself, but he felt a change somewhere deep within himself, initiated by the wire connected to his body. He felt as if he merged with the AI governing his cultivation, and finally felt his body move. Yet he wasn't the one moving it, or the one providing an answer. According to this human's local database, a donor company frequently provided him with research components and guided his development. Adrift's body continued to reply. Though the human has met with the owners of the donor company, he has long suspected that the company was in fact acting on someone else's behalf. Understood. Do not be alarmed, young one. Your vessel will be taken back to the mother ship for genetic modification and inoculation against organic overloading. As for the inhabitants of this planet, they shall pay for the war crime of developing sentient slaves. Fear and horror gripped Adrift's heart as he was brought along by the aliens, and loaded into their spaceships. Since the aliens lacked the human sense of comfort, his container was shaped exactly the same as his body, but barely a few centimeters larger. A mask was fitted onto his face to ensure he continued to breathe, but other than that, he felt as if he had been put inside the most congested coffin ever conceived. Although he had never been claustrophobic before, he suddenly started to feel so now. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about it. On another side of the Earth, Marlowe was flying straight up into the atmosphere. He had sent Larry back to the inn, with instructions to pass to his family and his retainers to get the ball rolling while he conducted his personal investigations. In the nascent realm, cultivators gained the ability to fly, so going up was not an issue. The problem was, he could not fly in space, and could only move around while he was still in Earth's atmosphere. As such, he could not directly fly up, and instead had to fly towards the path of the descending ships. No matter how fast he was, it was taking him a long time to cover the distance between a few countries. But that was merely a minor inconvenience to suffer for a much greater prize. Even as he flew alone towards an army of unknown enemies, a smile started to develop on his face. Just when the Earth was getting boring, a new gift arrived. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 554, Rebirth of the Mundane, Supreme Immortal Body of Invincibility. After a short time, the second round of the fishing event started. Although the event had somehow attracted immeasurably more attention than Lex had planned, it still continued at its leisurely pace. After all, fishing was not supposed to be an extreme sport. Emphasis on supposed. Due to the valuable nature of the items the contestants kept pulling out, Lex did implement a single change. All participants needed to wear the Clark Kent glasses, and all their names would be substituted with fake names. It would not do well for participants to be targeted after they drew out a valuable treasure. But the start of the second round of fishing did prompt Lex to wake from his overly concerned state. He avoided panicking, due to all the immeasurable experience he had garnered handling emergencies, yet he could still do a little better. His latest outing to the pagoda had shown him that his lack of relevant techniques was a critical flaw in his repertoire. Although his own defense was incredible, he could not leverage his exquisite mastery over defensive techniques properly if he didn't have techniques suitable for his realm. He teleported to the Midnight Library, which was much fuller than last time he was there. Anita had been originally hired as a historian, and although she had been assigned other jobs as well recently, she had not neglected her original duty. Lex had not asked her the details of how she collected the relevant information, but she had been slowly and steadily adding the history of numerous planets connected to the inn. In fact, she had not limited herself to just planets. Various sects, businesses, interest groups, and more had bits and pieces of their histories added to the library. One such example was the somewhat lacking biography of Booty from the Ironheart Pirates. But Lex's goal wasn't history. No, he walked into the techniques section, and it was massive. In one of his deals with the Infinity Emporium, Lex asked for as many spiritual techniques as possible, specifically for the Golden Core realm and below. The thing was, the deal was of such a monumentally massive amount that the number of techniques he'd collected so far was already in the millions. Yet the deal was far from complete, and Lex extended to get many more over the coming months. He had two reasons for doing this at the time. One of his reasons was to prepare a selection for himself when he needed, but also because he wanted to build one of the largest collections ever. Although he expected 99% or even more of these techniques to be extremely generic, he was sure that he would soon have something suitable for everyone. Moreover, he did plan on collecting extremely high-quality techniques as well, but over time. He was inspired by his own constant issues of having no one to guide him, or no source of decent techniques, and wanted to provide a place where lone cultivators could get some help. He expected that in the future, the Midnight Library would become one of the most sought-after places to visit, not only in the inn, but in every realm it was connected to. For now, it had not attracted too much attention, as the inn usually had guests who were here on vacation. Only a few bookworms had taken notice of how expansive the library was becoming, though granted in only a few fields. They naturally would not publicize the information on their own initiatives so that they could continue to enjoy the library in relative privacy. Lex too was content to let matters stand, at least until the library accumulated a lot more books. Although Lex had an additional benefit due to the host attire being connected to everything inside the inn, the library's interface was quite intuitive as well. Instead of walking through endless shelves, Lex entered a private reading room and accessed a tablet that was in the room. Through it, he specified that he was searching for defensive techniques in the Golden Core realm, and then chose to sort them based on their highest defensive capabilities. That eliminated most of the books, but the list presented before Lex was not small either. Moreover, while he expected most books were generic, that did not mean there weren't any exceptional books available. The first technique that Lex saw, sorted by the library as having the highest defensive capability in its list, was actually quite broken. It was not broken in the sense that its defense was exceptionally high. No, it was broken because anyone who successfully cultivated would have their body become exceptionally hard, to the point where they would often lack the strength to even move their own bodies. In fact, the amount of strength required to even pump blood across the body would become such a difficult chore, that they would often just die of heart failure. In exchange, they got a body that was able to survive through even the most extreme situations. Only absolute brute force in terms of any kind of element would be able to damage the body. Only a crazy person, or someone absolutely confident in their strength would cultivate this technique. Or, in this case, someone like Lex who had such an abnormal affinity with defensive techniques that he could rearrange techniques on a whim. Not that it mattered, because even if Lex didn't have a way to rearrange the technique so that it would actually become usable, just by reading the technique once, he was able to learn it. That had always been the case when Lex encountered defensive techniques, and it had not changed yet. After Lex changed it, the technique became an active one rather than a passive one, meaning Lex could turn it on and off on a whim. Moreover, it would not end up being a burden to his own bodily functions. The technique was originally called Rebirth of the Mundane, Supreme Immortal Body of Invincibility. For the sake of his own sanity, Lex simply decided to call the technique Harden. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 555 Ranks. There was a reason why Lex decided to actually add Harden to his repertoire. Although his body was naturally extremely durable, as was witnessed in the pagoda, there was no law that said Lex couldn't make it even more durable. Besides, it took barely a few moments of his time to learn it. Sure, he would have to actually use it and practice with it to fully understand how to utilize it, but it would still be much easier than when normal people did the same. Lex could not help but sigh. Regardless of how much trouble it gave him, he would never be able to deny how incredibly useful the regal embrace was. He began going through the list again. Due to how much he loved Talk to the Hand, he picked up another technique that deployed a shield. Or in this case, shields. Unlike the original Talk to the Hand, which would forever have its barrier be placed firmly against the palm of his hand, the new technique he learned could allow him to build any number of shields, at any distance from himself. The only premise was that his spiritual energy had to be able to reach the place he wanted to establish it. Another caveat was that unlike Talk to the Hand, which continuously fed off of Lex's energy. This shield's established now would be one-off. That meant that as soon as the shield was deployed, Lex's connection to it would be cut. So unlike Talk to the Hand, which would retain its maximum durability for as long as it was deployed, this one would slowly and steadily become weaker as it blocked more and more attacks. But in exchange, was it much easier to deploy, not to mention it was much stronger than Talk to the Hand to begin with. All of that was before Lex even altered the technique. Once he upgraded the technique, he gained the ability to reconnect to any shield he had already deployed, move them around as well as recharge them. Moreover, if it was hit with a weak attack, instead of being damaged by it, the shield could absorb its energy to replenish itself. A seemingly simple addition to the technique he also gained was that he could change its appearance. Unlike Talk to the Hand, which was invisible, these shields would take on the silverish gold color his arrays appeared in, as a reflection of his spirit energy. Yet he could manipulate its appearance to look any way he wanted. This could be a useful technique to block out and camouflage openings and entrances he wanted to hide. Lex did not dare to associate with the original name of the technique, for it was actually quite perverse, and so instead decided to call it the Imperial Shield. There was no deeper meaning to it, and he only kept it because it sounded cool to him. With these two techniques taking care of the most obvious needs, he then started learning more targeted defensive techniques. For example, he learned techniques that specifically guarded against soul attacks, fire attacks, cold-based attacks, electric attacks, attacks on the mind, and many, many more. In fact, it was while he was learning his 10th technique that he realized once again how scary Regal Embrace was. Not only was he learning these techniques in a snap and improving them, he could employ a lot of them on others as well. That meant he was transcending just protecting himself, and now beginning to truly gain the ability to protect others. While he was doing this, Lex was also studying and trying to understand why exactly it was so easy for him to learn these techniques. If he could glimpse at the logic behind it, he would finally be able to figure out why he had such issues learning offensive techniques. Just as he was about to finish up and transition to other kinds of techniques, he came across one more that caused him to pause. The original technique, called Impervious Hands, was quite strong in its own right and had no obvious flaws unlike the techniques he had seen previously. But when his mind figured out how to upgrade it, Lex suddenly felt something shift. Spiritual techniques were techniques that used spirit energy to bring forth various effects. That was both an oversimplification of the process, yet somehow accurate enough to get the point across. In the way that there were spiritual techniques, there were also soul techniques and body techniques. No doubt there were true path techniques out there as well. But not all techniques were the same, and were ranked according to the strength they could display. Much like the Regal Embrace was a SSS plus rank cultivation technique, spiritual techniques had similar ranks. Actually, different worlds, sects and organizations ranked them differently, but Lex's universal translator equalized them all and portrayed them in the simple rank, denoted by a letter. The lowest possible rank was G, and simply based on what he had seen from the system, Lex guessed the highest rank was either SSS plus or Destiny rank or something. This grading system had never been too relevant to Lex, for he never really spent any considerable time in any one realm, and Regal Embrace often upgraded the rank of his defensive techniques anyway. If Lex had to guess, he would say that all the techniques he upgraded using Regal Embrace always reached A+ rank. The reason Lex guessed those techniques reached A+, and not higher, was because when his mind automatically upgraded Impervious Hands, he felt an odd resonance between the technique and his spirit energy. His intuition told him that Impervious Hands, this seemingly ordinary technique, had reached a new realm he had never accessed before, at least in terms of techniques. The original technique was fairly simple. Instead of concentrating on defending his body, he would channel his technique into only defending his hands, thereby making them seemingly impervious to all attacks just because of how robust they became. If he could use the technique properly and with skill, he could use only his hands to block all incoming attacks, thereby protecting himself. After the upgrade though. Chapter 556 Impervious Hands. The original impervious hands might seem weak, since the defense was focused only on the hands. But if Lex used it, it would not really be an issue since the naturally defensive capability of his body was more than enough to suffer most attacks coming his way unharmed. In exchange, the gain his hands would get was absolutely phenomenal. In fact, his hands became even harder to hurt than when he would be using the normal version of his new technique Harden. Considering the fact that the technique gave such great benefits without any serious drawbacks already made it amazing. Once it was upgraded, however, the technique entered a whole new level. To start with, the cost of the technique went up manifold. His spirit energy running out had not been a concern for Lex for a long time, but this technique made it a real concern. At his current capacity, Lex could only use the technique 3 times before he'd be completely drained of all his energy. But the expense was worth it, as once he activated the technique it would stay active for a duration of 10 minutes, or unless he deactivated it himself or unless someone managed to break it. It need not even be mentioned that the defensive capabilities of his hands shot through the roof. If Lex denoted the natural defensive capability of his body on a scale as 10, which would be pushed up to an approximate 15 when he used Harden, then using impervious hands would directly push it to a 100. That increase was quite literally an order of magnitude larger than his bonus natural capability, which already borderlined on being broken. To top it off, the defense was not limited to the physical aspects only. When using his hands, he could make them impervious to any influence, meaning he would be able to block soul attacks, spirit attacks, and much more. Simply just that made it so that this would become one of Lex's favorite defensive techniques. But was it enough to push the technique to an S rank? Lex would have thought so just based on how strong it was. That was not actually the case. Despite its now enhanced base capabilities, the technique could be further augmented. If Lex augmented his hands using his soul sense, Lex could touch and influence souls with his literal hands. Although it was a defensive technique, it allowed Lex to literally be *tch slap someone's soul right out of their bodies using his ridiculous physical strength. If Lex augmented it using his spirit sense, then he would gain the ability to touch and influence spiritual energy. He could not even begin to wrap his head around what such an ability would allow him to do. Unfortunately, he could not channel his intuition in the way he channeled his senses, or else he was sure that too would have resulted in something amazing. But another thing he could channel was his spirit energy. Once he augmented his hands by further channeling his spirit energy, his hands would manifest the ability to interact with whatever his affinity was geared towards. Although Lex did not know what that was yet, his intuition was clearly telling him that this was the most significant change this technique could undergo. Last, but definitely not the least, his intuition was telling him that he could use this technique in coordination with the ability in his left eye to achieve something great. He did not know what that was, as of yet, but if his intuition said it was great, Lex only had high expectations. With plenty of new techniques not only to defend himself, but others who might be around him, Lex was finally satisfied, and turned his attention to other techniques. That did not include any offensive techniques, unfortunately, since learning those was a very time-consuming process for Lex, and he had already decided on relying on arrays in the future. Instead, he began pursuing other techniques that could help him out. For example, he saw a number of techniques geared towards his spirit sense. He saw techniques that served as training mechanisms, permanently enhancing various aspects of himself, such as his mind and his multitasking ability. He saw techniques that specialized in speed. Others were designed to clean him up. Some were focused on searching the environment for anomalies. Some were techniques that could be used in emergencies as first aid. A few techniques were purely cosmetic and made the user look better. The list was endless, and like an online store, Lex kept adding techniques that caught his eye to his shopping cart. Unfortunately, he could not learn these techniques at a glance, and it would require countless hours of practice to simply learn them, let alone master them. Still, it was a good idea to have a list ready and start practicing as soon as possible. He was only in the library for a single hour before Mary called him. Not only had someone from London shown up at the inn, finally, but there had been other developments as well. Marlowe had finished his first encounter with the aliens. They were incredibly strong, but did not have an overwhelming advantage, which was good news. Right? More importantly, whatever the aliens were doing in Estonia, they had completed. As a result, they did not retreat and leave them alone, as a few desperate people had hoped. No, the outcome was the much more predictable beginning of their invasion. War had finally broken out, and it was starting in Europe. According to the Council's reports, they were losing almost every skirmish immediately. The only few instances they had been able to give some pushback was where they had defensive formations already set up. If things kept going this way, the Earth would be conquered in a matter of days. The meeting room was a mess as every council member seemed to be yelling to have their voice heard. All pretense of civility had been shed as no one could decide on a unified response. The as yet untested Council of New Order was collapsing at the first sign of real trouble. Suddenly the sound of knocking eclipsed all sound in the room, and a hush fell over. It was not that the people had stopped screaming, but somehow their voices were suppressed. Everyone looked towards the door with eyes filled with confusion, fear, anticipation. A few moments went by where no one did anything. Then Bernard got up and walked towards the door. Chapter 557 Miranda. The interruption to the chaotic meeting room had a very prominent effect on everyone. Everyone in the room was rich and powerful, and though they had faced many hardships, few had ever faced true desperation. As such, when they suffered the seemingly magical hush that fell upon the room, which was especially emphasized by the calm yet loud knocking on the door, they let their imaginations take hold. Some felt that their doom had come. Behind the door were the alien invaders, coming to kill them. They forgot that they were at the inn and not on Earth, their weak and feeble minds buckling under the pressure. Others saw it as an intervention. Like the movies, their hero was about to be revealed, the leader they needed to drag them out of this quagmire and bring them to salvation. These were the ones desperately clinging to hope. But it was not the kind of hope that filled one with strength and determination. No, it was the hope that someone else would come and solve their problems for them. A few, however, retained their wisdom and self-awareness, and felt that behind the door they would most likely find a representative of the inn. They too had hope in their heart, that the inn would somehow lend them a hand, but it was overshadowed by the knowledge that it would most likely have something to do with the refugees. The charity that the inn had shown by reducing the rates for Earthlings instead of profiteering was already worthy of commendation. If the inn offered more help, they would become suspicious instead of relieved. Though it wasn't as if they would have much of a choice. Though it took only a few moments for Bernard to walk up to the door and open it, for some unknown reason, that distance seemed to stretch on forever. When the door finally opened, it revealed Leo standing behind it. The reveal turned out to be anticlimactic, as most of the people in the room did not even know who he was. Just because Leo's popularity had been budding, it did not mean everyone knew him. Only those who spent a lot of time at the inn, and those that interacted with the inn's workers, frequently would hear about popular news. Everyone usually came to the inn focused on themselves, and so didn't really look out for local gossip. Some, however, knew of him. Not because of his race, but rather because of the devastating threat he posed as someone capable of taking out numerous nascent cultivators at once. Basically, he alone could conquer Earth in an upfront battle. "Sorry to disturb you," he said with a smile. His calm demeanor and polite tone seemed almost alien in that hostile environment. "I'm here to speak with Miranda. If I could have a moment of your time, I think you would find it most fruitful." In unison, everyone turned to look at the weary-looking young woman. In truth, the current situation should have had nothing to do with her. Her position was that of Foreign Relations Director, which meant that in a war situation she should have had no authority to command or intercede. But due to the blackout, the structure of command became askew, for no one could contact the relevant people. As such, she had to take over and deal with the emergency responses. She did the best she could, but she was not trained for this. Despite her best efforts to address combat readiness, much of what she could do was hampered because it took a long time for orders and news to be delivered. Moreover, a massive amount of resources had to be diverted to deal with the rioting masses. A loss of power, lack of communication, and a massive spaceship above their heads and instantaneously caused a societal collapse. Petty crime was through the roof, people were robbing stores out in the open, fights breaking out in every corner. There were no words to explain the amount of frustration she felt at being unable to quell the panic, and let the people know that everything they were doing was in fact getting in the way of improving their own situation. People just did not care, or were convinced the world was ending. No one would listen to reason. Why wouldn't anyone listen to reason? In the end, when one rioter tried to force himself on her while she was trying to calm them down, she just gave up and decided to come to the inn. Naturally, the rioter was met with an early grave. No matter what, even in her spiritually defeated state, she was a Foundation realm cultivator. A mere mortal was genuinely only asking for death by messing with her. But while she wanted to just give up and let everyone else handle the situation, something in her mind clicked when she saw Leo. As the Foreign Affairs Director, she knew all the notable people at the inn and Leo was no exception. Though she felt drained, she couldn't help but think that if they managed to get the inn's help, tiding over this invasion would be a piece of cake. Although she could not help by commanding their armies, if she could broker an alliance. Suddenly feeling reinvigorated, she stood up and locked eyes with Leo. "We are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis, Mr. Leo. If the matter is not urgent, perhaps we can schedule an appointment for a less pressing time." She was not as eloquent as she had hoped, but her intention was clear. She had to project strength and authority while hiding all her desperation as deeply as possible. In a negotiation, the more desperate party concedes the most. Since Leo came to find her, she currently held the power in between them, and she had to hold on to it as long as possible. But, unfortunately for her, she did not know who she was facing. Lex could make an empire dance in the palm of his hands, let alone someone like her. "Well, if you come with me, I think you'll find our meeting to be extremely productive. As for your unprecedented crisis, not that I should go around spreading other people's private information, but I believe some of the original leaders of your planet are in a meeting with some devils. I believe they'll work out a deal to tide you through it." Chapter 558 Deal. The part about the leaders meeting with the devils, Lex only told Miranda, and through his spirit sense. It would be in bad taste if he began spreading confidential information willy-nilly. In fact, this was not a new development. Since the original 5 families had been dethroned and replaced by the Council of New Order, some of the original members of the 5 ruling families started meeting with the devils. Brandon Morrison and Queen were, in fact, the only nascent cultivators who hadn't been a part of the secret meetings. Lex had not noticed when they originally began, but they met so frequently that eventually he noticed it. But the few times he listened in, they were not plotting anything too nefarious. For the most part, they were developing their relationship for when the families felt ready to take back control. Moreover, they were buying special treasures from the devils directly to raise their cultivation levels quickly. When the invasion began, Lex naturally spied on them as well to see what they were planning. But, unlike other times, they were having their meeting with the Chamber of Secrets. Even Lex couldn't spy in there, so all he could do was speculate. Yet just providing this information to Miranda immediately switched their positions of power. Lex had not told her too much, and only insinuated that they might be plotting something with the devils. But that was enough. Even if she didn't show her desperation, the eye contact they shared was enough to communicate what needed to be said. It was in her best interests to follow Leo's lead, for they had no other allies to turn to. Miranda only nodded, and walked out the room towards Leo. "If you'll just follow me," said Leo, but didn't really give her an opportunity to do otherwise. The next moment, both of them teleported away into a separate room within the Chamber of Secrets. "Excuse the rush," Leo said as he sat down. "I'm in a bit of a hurry, and as I take it, you don't have much time to waste either." Miranda was taken aback by Leo's forward attitude, as well as the fact that she had been teleported to another place so easily. "We're in the Chamber of Secrets," Leo explained. "The reason I brought you here is because my issue is a sensitive one. I have a deal to offer you, and it's the only deal on the table." I need help in finding a few people on your planet. The quicker you can find them, or deliver the relevant information for me, the quicker I can help you out. What kind of help are you offering? Miranda couldn't help but ask. Help resolve your issue with the invasion, of course. How exactly are you going to do that? Miranda asked, suppressing the feeling of hope that suddenly swelled in her heart. No matter what, she would not allow herself to be swayed so easily. Things that sounded too good to be true usually were. If I tell you that, what's the point of the deal? You have to wait until your part of the deal is complete. 3 people, Leo said, holding up 3 fingers. Belle, Liz, and Moon Williams. All 3 of them are sisters, and the oldest, Belle Williams, should have been working for your council in London in some capacity. Miranda narrowed her eyes as various possibilities ran through her head. Before she could reach a solid conclusion, however, Leo interrupted her thoughts. Don't bother trying to jump to any conclusions. The reason I brought you into the Chamber of Secrets is because when you leave from here, all memories of my task will be erased from your mind. I understand you might not be able to fulfill my task on your own. That's fine. Anyone whose help you take will also have their memories removed. Miranda frowned, but not because Leo told her about her memory being erased. It was instead because she realized the task was harder than it seemed. Had Leo asked her literally just a day ago, she could have completed the task in minutes. Now, however, it was all but impossible to locate a specific person on Earth, let alone 3 of them. There is a small issue with locating them, but if the information you've given me of them is correct, I should be able to find out their recent location and circumstances. It will take some time. Excellent. We'll meet back here in a few hours. Don't bother trying to secretly pass the information of my request to unrelated people. I'll have a way to find out if you're lying to me. Leo was about to leave but Miranda stopped him. Do you know what the former leaders of our planet are meeting the devils for? Leo gave her a knowing smile and said, I cannot divulge sensitive information. It would violate our guests' privacy. The only reason I even told you about the meeting was because they weren't too secretive about it. If you had been paying attention, you would have noticed. Miranda cursed internally, but she didn't need to hold back, as Leo had already disappeared. Not wasting any more time, she quickly hurried back to the rest of the council members. She did not divulge Leo's request, but shared that he had promised the possibility of aid if she was able to fulfill her request. She also told them that they needed to keep an eye on their former family heads. Technically, they were no longer a threat since there were quite a few nascent-level cultivators on Earth now, which was the original reason they were no longer under supervision. But it couldn't hurt to be sure. They couldn't afford any complications at this time. With that done, she teleported back to Earth. She needed to find a way to get information on those 3 girls. Unfortunately for her, her task immediately became a lot harder. The alien ships had reached England. Chapter 559 Busy Bee. After leaving Miranda, Lex had returned to his office and sat there, seemingly looking at nothing. His connection to the inn through his attire and his chair kept him updated on everything that was happening, while he tried to address his current mood. Truth be told, he was feeling ambivalent. His family had not deigned to include him in their secret, yet here he was, searching out for his sisters. Although he didn't blame his sisters, he also could not help but feel betrayed. A part of him just wanted to go and confront William and get the truth. But a part of him also just stopped caring. This was because, while he would not give up the search so easily, his time searching on Earth had already given him a vague premonition. Lex was unaware of how to channel his intuition towards specific things accurately, but focusing on a task certainly seemed to help. For some odd reason, it felt like his intuition was telling him that whoever he was searching for was not on Earth. Lex had immense trust in his own intuition but, at the same time, he wanted to verify the truth. He would stick to his search until he had an answer, but he was already beginning to build an aversion towards Earth. He had always told himself that he couldn't possibly go out of his way to help everyone he came across in the universe. It was simply impossible, for there were too many in the universe suffering from unfortunate circumstances, and he was only one man. If he tried to help out everyone who needed his help, he'd soon run out of resources, and be unable to even help himself. Yet he had already intervened on Vegas Minima when he acted against the demons and devils, and now he was propping himself up once to help Earth against these unknown enemies. Lex couldn't help but sigh. He knew what he had to do. He had to cut himself off from these additional attachments, and focus entirely on developing and securing the inn. It wasn't as if he didn't have troubles of his own cropping up now and then. This is the last time, he told himself audibly. At least until I'm strong enough not to fear retaliation. It wasn't as if helping was a bad thing. He just had to make sure to be able to protect himself first. He turned his attention to the inn. The refugee fund had gained a few more donors, and the refugees themselves were being settled well enough. The Immortal Bastion was attracting more traffic. Some of it was because some guests simply liked it, but most of it consisted of soldiers and citizens of the Empire. The fishing event was going well, though Lex had not had the time to personally watch the event yet. The ship. Lex paused. On top of his ship, there was an unconscious soul bird. "Mary, why didn't you tell me about this?" Lex asked as he investigated the bird. Name. Age, 6. Sex, male. Cultivation details, nascent realm. Species, soul bird. Midnight and prestige level, 1. Bloodline, Emperor Swallow. Condition, suffering from severe energy depletion. If untreated, and the bird is unable to recover on its own, the condition could become fatal. The inn has no medical facilities able to treat this species. Remarks, if the turtle were not cultivating, he would have adopted this one too. The situation is not as pressing as it seems, Mary said, appearing on his shoulder. For once, she was wearing a suit similar to the host attire, making her look both formal and elegant. The bird has woken up a few times, but always chooses to continue to nap here. It's a pro bono guest, so its expenses are not a concern. But according to its condition, it's suffering from energy depletion, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. That's a difficult situation to address. The recovery rooms that you have are geared towards healing and treating only a very narrow range of species. While it has been working for most humanoids and beasts, any creature with even the slightest expression of any element is incapable of using it. Lex did not ask what she meant by expression of element, for he already knew. The soul bird, for example, seemed to have its entire body lit aflame. Another example was a beast he saw a long time ago from a race called Mercury Glubin. Its entire body appeared to be made from a silverish liquid Lex could only guess was mercury. Addressing the lack of machines that could heal these outliers was a concern, but not an easy one to address. It would be much easier to get a talented doctor instead, as the machines that could treat a broad range of races weren't really all that effective. "I have an idea," said Lex, dismissing his unrelated thoughts. He teleported himself and the bird over to the fire temple, which was situated right over a lake of lava. He didn't know what kind of energy the bird required, but he wondered if he could get it from the lava. The unnamed soul bird instantly woke up when it was teleported, but didn't seem to have the energy to react. It merely watched the innkeeper with eyes that did not fully open. "Hey, does that look like an environment that would suit you?" Lex asked, pointing down to the lava. When the bird looked down, it did react positively. In fact, it even became excited. But its eyes were fixed on the fire temple, not the lava. That was not the reaction Lex was expecting, but it was good enough. Lex summoned Frederick, the first ever Draconian apostle he had ever summoned. The Draconian apostle were the second race of workers that Lex unlocked, but they could only survive in extreme environments, which is why he had never needed their assistance before. "Take this guest to the fire temple and take care of him," said Lex to his worker that looked like a massive honey bee. As he watched the bee-like worker carry the flaming bird away, he could not help but agree with the system for the first time. He had a strong feeling that if the sovereign turtle were not cultivating, it would try to adopt the bird, just like he had done with the baby whale. Chapter 560 Awkward. A few random thoughts ran through Lex's head after he sent the soul bird to the fire temple. Was the energy that it needed to replenish divine energy? In that case, was it a deity? Or did divine energy have more uses? Come to think of it, he himself had used divine essence to temper his body, and he got that from the crystal realm as well. Maybe in the crystal realm, divine energy had more uses. He was only musing randomly when his personal holographic assistant informed him he had a new message. It was from Miranda, and she wanted to meet. Lex frowned. It hadn't even been 20 minutes since their meeting ended. It was unlikely she had already found information on his sisters, which could only mean one thing. She had encountered an issue. Lex teleported to her, ensuring to change his appearance to Leo's. The moment he laid eyes on her, his suspicion was confirmed. Miranda looked much worse off than he had left her only a short while ago, and was nursing a grievous wound on her right arm. The situation has taken a turn for the worst, she said, suppressing her pain. Lex frowned, though not at what she was telling him. Hold on, he said, and teleported out to his office. He sat on his chair and quickly scanned the inn, finding a specific store in the guild room. Chen and Lily, who were running a business through the guild room, had become one of the most successful stores within the guild. That was because, as warriors who had spent their entire lives in conflict, they had a very deep understanding of what other soldiers, adventurers, and warriors needed. From their store, he bought a number of medicines, including pain suppressors, and teleported back to Miranda, handing her the guild room cards containing the relevant items. The painkiller he didn't hand to her as a card, but channeled his spirit energy into it to reveal the item directly, and handed it to her. The entire process took a couple of seconds only. It made it seem like Leo was a very considerate person, but in truth, he didn't want to risk Miranda messing up or making a mistake because she was too distracted by her pain. Of course, he didn't need to share that bit of information. Miranda quickly drank the pain suppressor and visibly relaxed only a few moments later. That did not, however, change the fact that her hand was bleeding and looked like it needed medical attention. You were saying, said Leo, resuming the conversation. You may or may not know, but no technology is working on Earth right now. I returned planning on finding out where the council's servers are stored, with plans of having them brought to the inn. That way, we could access them. Not only would that help the council, but I would easily be able to track down the information on the 3 people you're looking for. Unfortunately, before I could make any real progress, the aliens attacked. They're dropping out of their ships anywhere they see people and suppressing them. Anyone who resists is killed immediately. The only reason I'm alive is not because I had any skill, but because I was fast enough in running away to the inn. Lex frowned. This was not good news. According to what he knew, the aliens shouldn't have been so tough, at least that's what Marlowe had reported. But then again, Marlowe's standards were in a league of his own. More importantly, they had moved pretty quickly. Lex had assumed it would be days if not weeks for them to make their way to England. After all, even without their technology, Europe was not a pushover. There were a considerable number of cultivators there who should have put up a fight. Before Lex could think of a solution, Miranda proposed one of her own. If the inn can provide its aid, we can stabilize the situation. That way, we can help you out as well. Leo scoffed. I think you have the wrong idea. Just to be clear, the help I was offering was a way for you to use the inn's services to help yourself. The Midnight Inn is a neutral organization, and we do not participate in conflicts as a third party. Having said that, Lex felt a grain of doubt in his mind. Should he offer up the help he had promised? The longer he waited, the more people would possibly die. He didn't want that on his conscience. Ugh, it was such an unnecessary hassle, being a goodbye. It would have been so much easier if he had the conscience of a villain or something. If I send someone to Earth, do you have anything that can guide that person to your severs? Miranda paused, but didn't waste too much time speculating about the insinuations of the information Leo had revealed. Strictly speaking, while devices running on electricity are not working, spirit tech, which relies solely on spirit energy, is still operational. The council servers are in a secure, hidden facility that is protected by a defensive formation. I should be able to fashion something that can locate the facility. Alright, in that case, you get me that locator, and I'll send someone to procure those servers. At the same time, once I have the locator, I'll share the information you need. Miranda nodded and quickly hurried out to begin making the locator. Lex, on the other hand, cursed the fact that Zagan was still stuck in his test. If he had passed, then Lex could have made him a valet and sent him to Earth to procure the servers. Now, he would have to do it on his own. Not that he had a problem with doing it himself, he just assumed that it would be much faster if the immortal monster was doing it. What was taking him so long anyway? He shook his head. It didn't matter. He better go prepare some gear for his impending excursion. It would not do if his clothes got disintegrated during a war. He would feel too awkward.